Hello everyone and welcome to Anyone Can Click. Today's is an on-field episode where I will take you through the entire process of clicking an image in Aperture Priority Mode. So let's begin.
A super helpful on-field reference guide of today's session is linked in the description box below. Click to get your copy. However, I do recommend you watch the video till the end for the guide to make sense.
So now I'm back to home base and I will show you how to turn this scene into this moment using the Aperture Priority Mode. But let's begin with the most fundamental question. What is the Aperture Priority Mode? It is the mode where the photographer decides the aperture, but the camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed to ensure that you get the correct exposure. Now what about ISO? ISO can be controlled by either the photographer or the camera depending on whether the auto ISO mode has been selected. And for this video, we will be controlling the ISO manually. The camera already evaluates the scene and determines the amount of light that it needs to give us a well-exposed photograph. Now we control some part of this light by setting the aperture and ISO, and the camera will decide how much shutter speed it needs to keep to bridge the balance. With that in mind, let's proceed with the workflow. Now the first question that I ask myself before I choose the shooting mode is this: is there a healthy amount of light in the scene? So when it's dark, maybe before sunrise or after sunset, or while shooting indoors in dimly lit conditions, I will not go for Aperture Priority Mode and instead I will opt for the manual mode. In such cases where the light in the scene is too low, the camera will have to set a very slow shutter speed to bridge the balance, which may result in shaky and blurry photographs. There are two other situations where I will not use the Aperture Priority Mode. The first one is when I'm employing certain specific creative techniques like panning or slow shutter, and the second one is if I'm using flash in the shooting process. Other than that, if there is good amount of light, my go-to mode is Aperture Priority, which actually is 80% of the time. Coming back to this scene, the scene has a good amount of light, so I have safely chosen the Aperture Priority Mode. Now there are three main settings to keep in mind while photographing in this mode. The first one, naturally, is aperture. The second one is ISO, and the third one is exposure compensation. Now let's begin with aperture. We've already seen that aperture controls two main aspects of the photograph: light and depth of field. To rehash, bigger the aperture size, more is the light which enters the lens, and shallower is the depth of field. So once you've decided on the mode, time to ask yourself question number 2. What is more important to you? For example, for me in wildlife, light is what is most important, because the more light I let in through my aperture, the faster the shutter speed can be, and that will help me freeze the motion that goes on in the wild. Besides, there are several other factors which can control the depth of field. But in situations where depth of field becomes important, let's say when you're photographing architecture, there you use aperture and you set it to control the depth of field that you want. For example, if you want a shallow depth of field, you're going to keep a very small f-stop number, but if it's the deep depth of field that you desire, you'll keep your f-stop number at a much higher value. We've learned all of this in detail in episode number 2, where we covered aperture. This is how I decide my aperture size. So next we come to setting number 2, which is exposure compensation. Now in episode number 7, we learned the various use cases of exposure compensation, but I'm going to quickly rehash the trick or formula that I had shared with you before.
If it's light, turn it right. If it's black, dial it back.
Here is a simple tip that I practice on field when it comes to exposure compensation. Now the use cases for a positive exposure compensation are actually very specific. Either you have a dark subject against a bright background, or you have a scene with a lot of lighter tones. In such situations, I start off by dialing in a positive exposure compensation. For every other situation, I keep my exposure compensation at the beginning at -0.7, which means that I'm cutting down the exposure by 2/3 of a stop. This is because I feel that tiny bit of negative exposure compensation somehow makes the colors look much more richer, much more deeper. You also avoid blowing out the occasional highlights. Our scene does not require a positive exposure compensation. I'm going to start off by setting an exposure compensation of -0.7. And finally, we reach setting number 3, which is ISO. As a starting point, I dial in the ISO based on the following ranges. For bright conditions like mid-afternoon sun, I keep an ISO of about 250. For overcast conditions or while shooting in the shade, I keep an ISO of around 400 to 800. And if I'm shooting early in the morning or late in the evening, I keep the ISO somewhere between 1000 to 1600. For this scene, it was an overcast day with a slight drizzle, so I've set my ISO at 800. And this is a setting that I will most definitely revisit again for fine-tuning. Now my tentative settings are ready. I've dialed in the aperture, I've dialed in the exposure compensation, I've dialed in my ISO. It's time to look through the viewfinder, focus, and see what shutter speed is the camera setting for me, and determine if this is the shutter speed that is right for me. And that depends entirely on what kind of movement I'm anticipating in front of me. Now there is a one-page guideline on the optimum shutter speeds for various situations, but I have distilled it down to 3 main points. For a fast-moving subject, I try to keep it faster than 1/1000. For slower subjects, I try to keep it around 1/500. And I always ensure that the reciprocal rule is followed, so my shutter speed cannot fall below 1 by focal length that I'm shooting at. But here is the catch. This important decision is not mine to make. It is made by the camera. So what do I do in situations where the shutter speed that is set by the camera is not where I want it to be? This is where ISO comes into play, and I will use my ISO to make the finer adjustments, not the aperture dial. So if my shutter speed is too slow, I'm going to bump up my ISO till I see the shutter speed at a point where I want it to be. On the other hand, if the shutter speed is too fast, faster than what I need it to be, then there's actually no problem, but I still have the option of dialing down my ISO to ensure that I get a much more cleaner image. It's as simple as that. So you look through the viewfinder, you have your settings ready, you compose your shot, and you click the shutter button. And then comes the most important part, you review the shot using the histogram. Now, it's possible that your shot will be exactly like the way you want it, but it is also possible that it may be a tad darker or lighter than what you would actually like it to be. In that case, you again revisit the exposure compensation dial. If your image is dark, then you increase the exposure by dialing in a positive exposure compensation. If the image is brighter than what you like, then cut down the exposure by dialing in a negative exposure compensation. But remember that when you tweak the exposure compensation, your shutter speed is once again going to change. A small tip for you here. When we decrease the exposure by dialing in a negative exposure compensation, the shutter speed that the camera is going to set will only become faster. It's not going to hurt your shot. But if we are increasing the exposure, that is when we need to be careful, because the shutter speed is going to become slower, because we're telling the camera that we need more light in the photograph, which is why you need to be careful while dialing in a positive exposure compensation. So again, when you pick up your camera and you're looking through your viewfinder, once again, look at the shutter speed. Again, make the finer adjustments using ISO, and you're good to go. My settings are complete. I will now wait for the opportunity, and I click. Now I know this entire process seems to be a little bit too much, but actually it's very simple, and let me show you in real time what that looks like. Before you get onto the field, you already know the purpose, so you've set your aperture. When you're on the field, you look at the scene, you look at the light, and you dial in your tentative numbers for exposure compensation and for ISO. Then look through the viewfinder, focus, and use the ISO dial to get the shutter speed in the range where you want it to be, and click away. And believe me, the more you practice, you will find that your tentative settings of the beginning actually pretty much work out to be the settings that you'll finally end up with. But remember, light changes very quickly, especially when you're shooting outdoors. And all it takes is one cloud cover to change your shutter speed, which is why when you're making your settings, ensure that you're trying to achieve the safe shutter speed and not the optimum correct shutter speed. This is because we have to account for such volatilities in the lighting conditions when they're not in your control completely. And remember that a noisy photo is always fixable, but a blurry photo is absolutely not. Now the second one is in dynamic scenes. For example, scenes where there is a lot of movement, your safest shutter speed is only as good as the fastest anticipatable movement. Big statement, let me break it down for you. Suppose you're photographing a bird, it's not moving, a shutter speed of 1/250, 1/400 should do the job. But that bird can move anytime, and that's going to actually be one of the most important shots of that series. But when the bird moves, and if you're at a shutter speed of 1/250 or 400, you're going to end up with a blurry photograph. So while you're photographing a stationary bird, account for its movement and make your settings in a manner that your shutter speed is somewhere around 1/1000, even if you don't need it at that point. This is what I do on field because I have lost very many shots because of my miscalculation of the shutter speed. With that, we have reached the end of today's video on Aperture Priority Mode, where we've taken this scene and turned it into this moment. But remember, this is just the exposure part. When you're actually shooting on the field, there are some other settings which come into play, like focusing modes, focusing areas, white balance, and we will cover all of it in due course. In the next episode, we will cover depth of field in depth, and we will also learn the role that it plays in impactful storytelling. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.